We're 4 months into 2026, and there are signs everywhere that seem to indicate that we are in for a perfect storm of disaster by the time that the year closes out. Now, when you look into that perfect storm of destruction seems to be occupying every aspect of society. You see it showing up in energy prices, the job market, the tech sector, disaster response, pandemic response, and everything in between. And all the signs are flashing yellow or red, which indicates that we might be in for a bumpy ride, especially considering the gross incompetence of the regime that's in charge. And in this conversation, I'm going to go through a handful of things that I see are particularly troubling. And all those things combined let us know that we need to buckle up, put our seats in our full upright and locked position, and put away our tray tables. For those of you who are catching this channel for the first time, make sure you drop me a follow, so that way you don't miss any of the conversations that I have on a week-to-week basis, and appreciate your support. So what exactly am I talking about? What is this disaster that's looming? Now, I'm not saying that there's actually going to be a disaster, but everything that I look at indicates that things are bad, and they're getting worse. First things first, let's take a look at the economy. The job market is weak, inflation is high, we're in the middle of a devastating oil shock, and that's only getting started. And the conditions that we're talking about today are almost the exact same conditions that existed in the 70s that was kicked off by another crooked Republican who was in charge, Richard Nixon. And that's on the optimistic side. If all hell breaks loose, we could be looking at something that is a generational disaster that we're staring down the barrel of. And this is something that was predicted well before this regime took over.
Donald Trump has no plan for you. And when you look at his economic plan, it's all about tax breaks for the richest people. I am offering what I describe as an opportunity economy, and the best economists in our country, if not the world, have reviewed our relative plans for the future of America. What Goldman Sachs has said is that Donald Trump's plan would make the economy worse, mine would strengthen the economy. What the Wharton School has said is Donald Trump's plan would actually explode the deficit. 16 Nobel laureates have described his economic plan as something that would increase inflation and by the middle of next year would invite a recession. You just have to look at where we are and where we stand on the issues. And I'd invite you to know that Donald Trump actually has no plan for you because he is more interested in defending himself than he is in looking out for you.
Keep in mind that this is a regime that during its first go-around engineered the worst economic conditions since the Hoover administration. And at the top of the food chain is a guy who bankrupted a booze company and a casino. So the level of incompetence at the top of the food chain that if we were living in normal circumstances, this person would have never been given a first opportunity to grab the reins. And yet, because we are living in the stupidest circle of hell, we've given this guy a second bite at the apple, and it's looking like it's going to be so much worse. And to put all of this into context, once 2025 wrapped up, we learned that over that entire year, somewhere in the neighborhood of only 180,000 jobs were created. That is a disastrous showing, especially when you consider that 1.2 million people were laid off in 2025. And 2026 is shaping up to be a continuation of what we saw in 2025, and that's the best case scenario. The second bit of bad news that we need to look at are the growing signs of a tech sector implosion. And there's a bunch of different things that make up this potential implosion, but a couple of the things that stood out in my mind are what's happening with all of the social media apps that we see in the US. Now, in terms of social media, US tech companies have effectively led the charge, whether you're talking about Meta and its suite of products, whether you're talking about X, or whether you're talking about YouTube and their suite of products. The US has owned the social media space, and some of the best performing companies in the Dow Jones are US tech companies. But something interesting is happening in the light of this regime being in charge. You're seeing European and Asian companies actively looking for alternatives that are domestic analogs to US products. because their argument is that the US products present a security risk. And you can't blame them for thinking that. Additionally, something else that you're seeing is that US social media companies are starting to bleed users. Meta in particular, for the first time in 7 years, reported that their user base has shrunk. And that's not surprising considering that Meta, out of all of the social media companies in the US, is the one that is most singularly responsible for the rise and entrenchment of Donald Trump and his disinformation engine that he has leveraged thanks to lessons learned from his Russian masters. So when you see European and Asian companies move away from US tech, social media user bases shift away from US social media providers, it gives a signal of an impending implosion of that sector. At the intersection of both tech and the economy, you have all of the AI companies, and you have all of the impacts of AI entering into the marketplace. Now, whether the job losses are being driven by AI or if it's being used as a convenient excuse, that's a discussion for another day. But one of the interesting things that you see when it comes to the discussion of AI are two really curious trends that are happening. On the one hand, you have thousands of CEOs who are saying that while AI has come into the market, they've seen no measurable impact in terms of profitability or productivity. So you have a tool that's being pushed as a world-changing tool, and yet none of it is impacting the bottom line in any major way other than giving people an excuse to eliminate their workforce. And you've seen the tech sector employees get absolutely crushed in wave after wave of layoffs. So that's one aspect of that conversation that's interesting. When we talk about the perfect storm of disaster that's brewing, the job market is definitely one. The economy in general is part of that equation. You have the declining influence of US tech and social media. You have the influence of CEOs all across the country saying AI hasn't made any impact into their businesses. But here's where it gets interesting. Sam Altman, CEO of OpenAI, is now backing support behind a number of bills that are going through various state houses that seek to insulate the company and their executives from any sort of economic disaster or widespread injury to people caused by their AI models and their AI infrastructure. Why would they be doing that? And they specifically cite serious injury of 100 or more people, or at least $1 billion in property damage. Why would an AI company be seeking protection of that sort? What's going on with their technology or their technology infrastructure where a CEO would feel that this is a necessary requirement for them to continue doing business? And that's paired with what we've seen in terms of legislation that's come out from the federal government that dictates that states can pass no laws to regulate what AI is doing. That is a big red flag. And that is a sign of a massive disaster, either economically or environmentally, or both. The only reason that a company would seek that sort of protection is if they know something is about to happen and they're trying to get ahead of it and cover themselves. So the question becomes, are we about to see a massive world-crushing economic crash thanks to US tech companies and AI companies and their Ponzi schemes finally coming crashing down? That remains to be seen, but given all of the circular investment that you've seen within this sector, you can't rule that out. All of that sounds bad, and it is bad. You know how to make it worse? Layer on a pandemic. Layer on a pandemic on top of all of those things, and now you have a near perfectly baked disaster pie that you're looking at. So what am I talking about? Well, we all know how well the idiots in charge of this regime managed the last pandemic. It looks like that performance was so effective that they're bringing back potentially a sequel. And here's what's going on. This regime appointed a guy with a brain worm and an affinity for harvesting dead raccoon penises and put him in charge of the Department of Health and Human Services. A guy who thinks vaccines cause autism and his own anti-vax positions already had a death toll before he ever attained office. And this is the guy that's going to be in charge of pandemic response if something hits the fan. And guess what? It looks like something might be hitting the fan. This stuttering, muttering idiot in charge fired all sorts of inspectors of cruise ships. He fired all sorts of scientists within the department and has effectively kneecapped the entire CDC with his kook wingnut theories about stuff that he knows nothing about. And whenever you do things like that, guess what happens? Stuff hits the fan because you have a bunch of morons in charge. So what exactly is going on? Well, looks like we might be at the early stage of a Hantavirus outbreak. And of course, after cutting hundreds of experienced people who inspect cruise ships, you have an outbreak that started on a cruise ship. And while that cruise ship is quarantined and people aren't being let off, we're now globally tracking cruise passengers and airline passengers who have come in contact with these people all over the world. And there are already 11 confirmed cases of hantavirus that have been tracked to this particular cruise ship. And here's where it gets interesting. The incubation period for this particular virus is 4 to 8 weeks. So we won't fully know what's going on until June or July. Does that sound familiar? All of these things taken together point to a level of disaster that is brewing that could be beyond anything that we've ever seen. And all of us would be a little bit more confident in our ability to deal with it if we actually had competent people in charge. But instead, who is in charge driving the ship? We have an 80-year-old diapered orange dementia patient who can't stay awake and is falling asleep standing up, and his collection of compromised morons surrounding him. And if an outbreak happens, you got the guy that likes to harvest raccoon penises in charge of formulating the response. Doesn't exactly inspire confidence. The only thing that we can hope for is that this is all overblown and it's nothing to worry about. Hopefully none of these things combine to create that perfect storm. But that's really all we're reduced to. We can't rely on competence and expertise because this is quite literally the dumbest administration ever put together. So now all of us are reduced to thoughts and prayers that this doesn't go sideways. And whenever you reduce to thoughts and prayers, you know everything's going to go sideways.